a client of mine who purchased a multifamily complex in the city of Oakland and had only owned that property for a little more than a few days before a person on the street, it wasn't a bad part of the city, but someone on the street broke into the property, made a way for themselves to get into the property, and then invited some of their friends to come into the property as well. And they all started ingesting illegal substances. Now, obviously, when my client caught wind of it, she called the police, even before she called me, which I would suggest in that situation. The problem is the police looked at her and they looked at the tenant, the first person who came in, and he looks at the tenant, he says, I would actually argue it's not even a tenant. But he looks at the guy and he says, do you live here? And the guy said, well, yeah, this is my place. And he looks at my client and says, well, there's nothing I can do. You have to get a court order from a judge because under Oakland law, the property is his to inhabit. And so that example, I think, demonstrates the flaw in the ideology of housing is a human right. Because I'm sure, and I am certain, I know this for a fact, there's someone that represents this individual who works for an advocacy group that has been funded by the city, who's going to defend this guy, right? And I can't speak for the other side's beliefs or this individual's beliefs that represents him, but I can tell you the ideology in even representing an individual like that on the city's dime, which means it's on the taxpayer dime, which means it's on the landlord and my property, my client's, the property owner's dime. She's paying for this guy's representation that found a way into her property. There is a fundamental problem with the logic when it is applied in that way. Because I can tell you, believe it or not, there are advocates in the state of California right now believe that by any means necessary, everyone should be guaranteed and entitled to housing. Whether it comes by you taking occupancy and not paying the rent over a period of time and just saying, well, I'm here and it is what it is, or you breaking into the property or perhaps changing the locks on a property, that's another story of another day, and finding an unconventional means into the property. Once you occupy that property, you can engage in certain unlawful means, but because housing is your right, those individuals get to stay there at the expense of the property owner. That's the problem. The worst part here is it's not just like my client can go to the judge and say, give me a court order. My client's going to have to pay tens of thousands of dollars to get that individual who broke into her property out of the property. And by the way, she's not going to be receiving rents for that 3 to 4 month period, pending her trial or pending her hearing, right? She's going to have to go through that whole process likely, and she's going to have to fight tooth and nail to get her property back from this individual that came across an opportunity to break into her property. I have not found a more, I've never found a better analogy or comparison for the city of Gotham, but here it is, right? Laws that encourage and incentivize tenants. And I didn't know this until recently, until I saw this example. I'd heard stories about this before this happened, but there are laws that encourage and incentivize tenants to break the law in order to get housing here in the state of California. And I'm convinced Oakland's not the only place that tenants are doing this. It's the only place I know of that's done it, but I'm convinced they're not the only ones doing it. One of the things that you're really seeing is this change in the ideology behind these laws. And it's the culmination of a long history of different acts that have happened in the state of California. The school of thought, perhaps 20-something years ago, was that landlords are entitled to rights as a matter of law. They should be able to transition tenants if they needed to, or if the tenant stopped paying rent, they should have the right to retake possession of their property and occupy it with another rent-paying tenant. In short, they should be able to do what they want to with the homes that they own, right? not a controversial topic. The problem is that there's been a real shift over the last 20 years, which I think really climaxed at the peak of COVID-19. And you'll note between March of 2020 up to now, all of the rights that landlords knew as their own that were indisputable have been completely challenged. Their worlds have been turned upside down. And it's all behind this ideology, this thought that if I am the tenant, well, forget who you are. The thought is that housing is a human right. You heard that term before, I'm sure. Everybody around, if you're in California, you've heard the term at some point, the phrase, the refrain, housing is a human right. Now, if you hear that term, it sounds great. Everybody can get behind housing as a human right because everybody can get behind the belief that everybody should be in housing. Everybody should have access to housing. I believe that, right? That's not a controversial statement. What makes it controversial is the way in which it is being applied in California. And I think there are two schools of thought behind that statement. Housing is a human right. I think the actual meaning of that statement could and should be that everybody has a right to seek housing. Everybody has a right to access housing. Everybody has a right to acquire housing. You think about the American dream. It's to have the property, to have a house, to have a family to support, and to have what we call prosperity, the right to all the liberties and freedoms you hear about in the Declaration of Independence that come with property, right? The problem is the way people are using that phrase, the way advocates and government officials and entities across the state of California are using that phrase now and have been using that phrase even prior to COVID-19 in 2020. They have been using that phrase to suggest that housing is an entitlement, not a right. A right means that I have the right to achieve something. I have the right to access it, but I'm not guaranteed. I'm not entitled to it. If you're entitled to something, it's just yours by merit alone. You don't have to do anything for it. It's yours, right? And there's nothing anybody can do about it. The danger in the ideology behind housing is a guarantee, is an entitlement, which is the way that people are using the phrase housing is a human right, is that housing as an entitlement and a guarantee comes at a cost to the person who owns the property, whoever it is. Case in point, if I own a property and I have a tenant who finds his or her way into my property, whether they do so lawfully or unlawfully, and they do something to breach the agreement I have with them, if they stop paying the rent, if they start committing a nuisance or something goes wrong, I have the right, I would like to think that I have the right to transition the property to someone else or to retake possession of my property. There should be nothing controversial about that because it's my property, right? These advocates today, and you're hearing this prevailing statement, this chant, movement, that housing is a human right, these individuals, a lot of these individuals, are using that statement to suggest that the tenants or the occupants, whoever they are, have an absolute right to whatever property that they inhabit, whether they're on a lease agreement, whether they have made their way into that property through some unconventional means, that they have an absolute right to whatever property they want to live in and wherever they want to be, which is to say, not only that housing is a guarantee or an entitlement, but that it's not a guarantee or an entitlement to the person who actually owns the property. That's the fallacy. You can't say housing is a human right or housing is a guarantee, while at the same time saying, well, it's a guarantee for some, but not others. If you happen to own the property and I happen to take possession, it's my guarantee, but it's halfway yours. That's, and I laugh about it not because it's funny as applied in California, but because of just the fallacy and the logic right? You don't have to be a controversial person. You don't have to be on the left. You don't have to be on the right to understand there's a fundamental problem with the belief that housing is a guarantee or a human right. If it comes at the cost of the person who owns the property, who holds the deed, who holds title to the property, whatever the property is, there's a problem. And that's why I believe that housing is not a guarantee. It's not an entitlement, because to say so would suggest that individuals who own their property are only entitled to it under certain means or only under certain conditions, right? So I think that ultimately we need to wake up as a society to this statement, this logic, this false logic that housing is a human right. Reject that notion and instead adopt the real sound logic, which is housing should be a human right for everybody who wants to acquire it, who's going to do what it takes to achieve that property. And once you own that property, it is yours as a human right.